Rivière aux Rats Road, Upper Saint-Maurice Watershed, Quebec, February 1954, 5:15 in the morning. Aurel Dufresne, 43, 9 winters hauling pulpwood out of the Belleau camp, backed the International up to the loaded sled at the landing and would not let anyone else set the hitch. The temperature stood at 11 below. The sky over the spruce line had not yet started to gray. The sled carried 11 cords of 4-foot black spruce, cut and piled through January by men who would not see this load again until it reached the river. Behind Dufresne, the camp's other trucks were still cold. His was already running. He had started it at 4:40, the way he started it every morning of the haul, because a Blue Diamond 6 that had sat all night at 11 below did not turn over on the first try, and a driver who wanted to leave the landing before full light knew to give the engine 40 minutes before he asked anything of it. He checked the chain hitch himself, not because the hostler who had built it that morning could not be trusted. The man had built 2,000 hitches in his years at Belleau, but because in 9 winters, Dufresne had come to treat the hitch as the one part of the rig that was his responsibility and no one else's, the same way he treated the second creek crossing 11 miles down the road as his and no one else's. He ran his glove along the top link, felt for the give that told him whether the chain had seated flush against the bunk stakes, and only then climbed into the cab. The road ahead of him ran 18 miles from the landing to the river, through country the camp's crew had never straightened and never would, because straightening it was not what the road was for. It carried loaded sleds down to water for perhaps 4 months of the year and stood nearly empty the rest. What waited for Dufresne at mile 11 was not marked on any map the company kept in its office. It was marked only in what he did with his hands at that specific point in the road, every single time he drove it, and had been marked there since a February morning in his second winter when he had not done it. And the sled had told him, in the space of about 4 seconds, exactly what happened to 11 cords of black spruce on packed snow when a driver's judgment of that one crossing was wrong. He pulled out from the landing at 5:19, the International's headlights the only light on the road for the next 2 hours. Behind him, the camp went on sleeping for another 26 minutes before the cook's fire started. What did 9 winters on this 18 miles of road, and one afternoon early in his second winter that he had never once described to another driver in full, tell Aurel Dufresne about the second crossing that no company instruction, no road map, and no hitch inspection had ever needed to record? The truck under Dufresne's hands was an International KBS-6, a conventional highway truck built by International Harvester's Chatham, Ontario plant several years before this particular February morning, carrying a 100-horsepower Blue Diamond 6 under the hood and a 2-speed rear axle that gave it a low range for pulling and a high range for running empty back to the landing. It had not been designed for pulpwood, and it had not been designed for towing a loaded timber sled over packed snow. It had been designed to move freight on a road with a hard surface underneath it. The Belleau camp used it this way regardless, because a truck that could pull in low range at a walking pace, hour after hour, without the engine laboring past what a gasoline 6 could sustain at 11 below, was worth more to a subcontractor camp than a purpose-built sled tractor the company had no other use for 9 months of the year. What the 2-speed axle gave Dufresne on the loaded haul was control at low speed, not through any braking system built into the truck, but through the plain mechanical fact that a loaded truck in low range, engine still turning against the drivetrain, resisted a grade's pull in a way the same truck in neutral would not. This was the entire braking strategy for the run down to the second crossing. Low range, a light foot on the service brake to avoid locking a wheel on packed snow, and a continuous read of what the sled behind him was doing to the truck's rear end through the chain hitch. There was no engine compression brake on this truck, and would not be for years yet on equipment of this class. The technology existed for larger diesel highway rigs elsewhere on the continent by the mid-1950s, but it had not reached a 5-year-old gasoline conventional running out of a Mauricie subcontractor camp, and it would not have solved this particular problem regardless. The problem was never simply speed. It was a loaded sled, joined to the truck by chain rather than by any rigid frame, with its own opinion about where it wanted to travel on a downhill curve in snow, and a truck whose only real answer to that opinion was the driver's hands, correcting before the sled's momentum became the truck's problem rather than the sled's own. What the KBS6's engineering could not do was tell Dufresne, on any gauge in the cab, what that sled was doing behind him at a given moment on a given bend. Whether the hitch had gone slack for half a second over a dip in the road, a half second that mattered more at the second crossing than anywhere else on the 18 miles. The truck's engineering ended, in a practical sense, at the tailgate. Before we go further, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian logging truck culture from 1920 to 1980. What the truck was, what the road required, and what the driver who ran the same 18 miles for 9 winters knew about the relationship between them that no international harvester specification sheet and no company road instruction had ever needed to record. Not spectacle. The documented mechanical and operational intelligence of an industry that moved a nation's newsprint out of the bush from the inside of a cab on a road with no margin for a driver who guessed wrong. The specific relationship between a loaded international pulling a timber sled over packed snow, 18 miles of company road, and a driver who knew the exact afternoon that snow would stop holding produced a form of judgment that no provincial highway and no hydraulic loader has ever been built to need again. And if you drove these roads, or your family did, put it in the comments. If you or your family hauled pulpwood on a Saint-Maurice Valley Company road, rode a river drive, or worked a camp de bûcheron anywhere in the Mauricie, what do you remember about the road or the river in the season it turned against you? A future video on this channel will follow the drivers of the Saint-Maurice itself, the men who rode the pitoon down the river that this truck's whole winter of hauling was built to feed. Back on the road, what happened behind the KBS6's tailgate, on a chain on packed snow on a road the truck's own engineering had no way of reading, was Dufresne's problem alone. What exactly had the 18 miles between the landing and the river asked of him that a 5-year-old highway truck's engineering had never once been built to answer? The company road that Dufresne drove was not built the way a highway was built, and it was not built to last. Bellow's small crew of roadmen had cut it by hand through the Rivière au raw country in the years before the war, following the natural grade of the land wherever they could, cutting through only where the terrain forced them to, because a subcontractor camp had no engineering department and no budget for grading equipment. What underlay most of the 18 miles was not gravel or crushed stone. It was the same boreal muskeg and thin soil that underlay the forest on either side of it, soft, waterlogged ground for most of the year, and passable to a loaded truck for exactly the months that ground stayed frozen solid beneath the snow. This was the fact that shaped everything about the road's engineering, or its near absence of engineering. It did not carry weight because it had been built to carry weight. It carried weight because winter froze the ground hard enough for a few months to do the job that gravel and drainage would otherwise have had to do. Before the freeze came each fall, the road crew packed the worst sections as best they could, corduroy of small logs laid crosswise over the softest ground, cut brush filled into the low spots. But the road's real foundation every winter was the frost itself. Several feet down in a good year, going into the ground through November and staying there until the spring thaw broke it apart again. Camps like Bellow's ran their entire winter haul inside that narrow window, because outside it, the same road that carried a loaded international in February would not carry a man on foot in June without swallowing him to the knee. This was the road's whole calendar. Mud before the freeze and after it, snow and frozen ground in between, and a hauling season measured in weeks rather than months. Once the frost had done its work, the camp's crew packed the snow itself into a driving surface. A horse-drawn roller, the same equipment logging operations across the province used on their own company roads, dragged back and forth over freshly fallen snow until it compacted into something a truck's tires could grip rather than sink into. A single lane, no more. Because a 2-lane snow road took twice the packing, and Belleau did not have the horses or the crew to spare for a road that carried, on a busy day, perhaps 6 loaded trucks in each direction. The grade followed the Rivière aux Rats itself for most of its length. Gentle where the river ran gentle, steeper in the last 3 miles before the second crossing, where the valley narrowed and the road had no choice but to follow the land down toward the water. It was in those last 3 miles, and in the crossing itself, that everything the road's construction had not solved, everything a subcontractor's road crew, working with axes and a horse roller and no formal engineering training, could not build their way out of, became the driver's problem instead of the road's. What exactly did those last 3 miles do to a loaded truck and sled that the other 15 did not? The 3 miles past the halfway marker dropped harder than anything else on the road, and they dropped into a valley that narrowed as it went, until the boreal wall on either side stood close enough that a driver lost the wide, flat light he had for most of the haul, and drove instead through a kind of green-black corridor that held its own shadow even at midday. The road crossed 2 creeks in that stretch. The first, at mile 9, ran shallow and wide, and the road crossed it on a low fill that gave a driver nothing to think about. The second, at mile 11, was neither shallow nor wide where the road met it, and it was this crossing, and only this one, that the camp's drivers meant when they said, without needing to specify further, the crossing. The creek at mile 11 cut a narrow gully across the road's line, deep enough that the company had built a short timber and fill approach down into it and back up the far side rather than route around it, since routing around it would have added 2 miles. The camp had no road crew to spare for building. The result was a road that dropped sharply for perhaps 80 feet, crossed the frozen creek bed on packed snow and ice over a corduroy footing, and climbed back out at very nearly the same pitch it had gone down, with a bend built into the bottom of that dip, because the creek itself ran at an angle to the road's line, and the road had no choice but to follow it rather than cut straight through. What made the crossing dangerous was never any single piece of that geometry on its own. It was the combination, a loaded sled, joined to the truck by chain rather than rigid coupling, arriving at the bottom of a downhill grade already carrying momentum. The truck's low gear and light braking had only partly checked, meeting a bend at the exact point where the road's surface changed character. Packed snow on the approach, but ice on the crossing itself, glazed by creek moisture that never quite froze the same way twice. A sled that had tracked straight and true for the previous 80 feet could, on that ice, begin to travel at a slightly different angle than the truck pulling it. At 11 below, with the ice hard and dry, this difference in angle rarely amounted to anything a competent driver could not correct with the wheel. At a slightly higher temperature, with the ice glazed wet on top by meltwater the previous afternoon's sun had put into it, it amounted to considerably more. And the 2 conditions could look, from a truck's cab at 5 in the morning with a headlamp for light, nearly identical. This was not a fact any driver at Belleau had ever been formally taught. The company kept no instruction for it, because the company's road standard, such as it was, described a crossing's width and its fill material and nothing about what the ice on top of that fill did at different temperatures on different mornings. It was a fact a driver learned by being wrong about it once, and by what that single wrongness cost him. What had Aurel Dufresne been wrong about? On one specific February afternoon in his second winter, that every driver who came to that crossing after him needed to learn without paying the same price he had already paid to learn it? The afternoon that taught Aurel Dufresne about the second crossing came in his second winter, in a February that had turned unseasonably mild for 4 days, running before dropping back into a hard frost overnight. He did not know, driving down toward the crossing that afternoon with 11 cords behind him, that the ice at the bottom of the dip carried a skin of meltwater from the mild spell, refrozen glassy smooth under a light dusting of new snow that made it look, from the cab, exactly like the dry-packed surface he had already crossed 100 times that winter. He took the approach the way he always took it then, low gear, a light touch on the brake, eyes on the road ahead rather than on the mirror, because in those years he had not yet learned what the crossing demanded of him. Instead, eyes on the sled's track in the mirror as much as on the road ahead, since the sled would tell him what the ice was doing before the truck did. At the bottom of the dip, on the bend, the sled's rear runners found the glazed patch first. It came around, not violently, not a jackknife, but a slow sideways drift of 11 loaded cords that put the sled's front runner within perhaps 3 feet of the gully's edge before the truck's own traction and Dufresne's hands corrected the angle and brought it back into line. 3 feet. He never forgot the distance because he had not measured it in the moment itself. He estimated it afterward, standing beside the idling truck, looking at the mark the runner had left in the snow at the very lip of the drop. He told no one at the camp what had happened that afternoon, beyond the bare fact that he had had a moment at the crossing. Camp shorthand that asked no follow-up questions, since every driver on the road had a hill or a crossing that had given him a moment at some point, and the working etiquette was not to press a man for details he had not offered. What he did after that afternoon, he did with Aisha out discussing it with anyone. He began watching, not just the crossing's ice, but the previous day's weather, building a private, unwritten sense of which conditions turned dry-packed snow into the specific glazed hazard that had nearly taken him and 11 cords into the gully. Sun on the ice. The previous afternoon, an overnight refreeze, then a light snow that hid the glaze from the eye. That was the combination. He learned to recognize it from the cab before he ever reached the crossing. In a particular gray-white sheen, the road surface carried under his headlamps that told him, on certain mornings, to take the bend at a walking pace rather than the pace he took it on every other day. By his 9th winter, he had crossed that dip roughly 1,800 times. He never told the camp's other drivers what he watched for, or why, in any more detail than go slow if she looks slick after a mild spell. He did not think of it as knowledge worth writing down, because nothing about the work had ever suggested to him that a driver's private read of one crossing's ice was the kind of thing that got written down. It lived in his hands, in the particular pressure he set on the wheel at that specific bend on that specific kind of morning, and nowhere else. What did the load riding behind him, 11 cords of green-black spruce joined to the truck by chain rather than any rigid frame, contribute to what had nearly happened at that crossing, that a lighter or a drier load would not have? The answer to what the load contributed to the crossing began at the landing, hours before the truck ever reached mile 11. 11 cords of black spruce, cut to 4 feet and piled by the camp's fallers through January, did not become a load on their own. A loader, at Belleau, usually the same 2 men all winter, because building a sled load that would hold together for 18 miles was a skill the camp did not trust to just anyone, stacked the cordwood onto the sled's bunks in a specific pattern. The heaviest, greenest wood, low and to the center, the drier and lighter pieces built up and out toward the edges, the whole stack drawn in tight against the bunk stakes on either side, before the load binders went on top. green-black spruce, freshly cut, carried more water weight than the same wood would carry by March. After weeks of winter air had pulled some of the moisture out of it, 11 cords of February-cut green spruce sat heavier and, more importantly for what happened at the crossing, carried its weight lower and denser than a comparable load of half-dried wood would have. No one at Belleau discussed this as physics. It was a fact the loaders knew as a hand feel. How a chain binder drew down differently over green wood than over dry. How the sled sat lower on its runners under a green load. How the engine worked harder pulling it away from the landing. What it meant at the crossing went largely unspoken. A heavier, lower riding load carried more momentum into the dip, and more momentum meant a longer, harder correction if the ice at the bottom did what it had done to Dufresne in his second winter. The chain hitch itself, the connection between truck and sled that Dufresne checked personally every morning, existed because a rigid coupling of the kind used on some highway logging trailers would have transmitted every twist and yaw the sled's own path put into it directly back into the truck's frame on a road this uneven. The chain absorbed some of that motion instead, at the cost of giving the sled a half-second or more of independent movement before the truck's steering could influence it. The exact half-second that mattered most on the ice at mile 11, and the exact trade-off that made the whole rig workable everywhere else on the 18 miles. A load built loose, or built with its weight wrong, made every one of these problems worse before the truck ever left the landing. A load built tight and correctly weighted gave Dufresne the only real margin he had at the crossing. Not a safety system, not a brake, but 11 cords of wood arranged by two men's hands in a way that made the truck's job and the driver's marginally easier on the one stretch of road where marginal mattered most. What did the men who built that load, back at the landing, know about wood, weight, and winter that the drivers who hauled it never had cause to learn? And what did the camp built around all of them actually look like? The camp that Dufresne drove out of every morning was not large by the standards of the biggest company operations on the Saint-Maurice. Perhaps 40 men through a winter season, split between the cutting crews in the bush, the road crew, the two loaders at the landing, and a handful of drivers running the trucks. It was a subcontractor's camp, one of many small operations supplying larger paper companies without belonging to them directly, a structure that had defined the valley's forest economy for decades. Big paper interests buying wood from small crews of independent operators scattered across the watershed, each crew responsible for its own camp, its own equipment, and its own road. The camp's day began before Dufresne's did. The cook and his helper were up at 3, building the stove fire and starting the morning's bread and porridge in the cookhouse, a plain log building heated by the same kind of wood stove that heated the bunkhouse next door, with long oilcloth-covered tables where the cutting crews would eat in the near silence once the cook's call brought them in around 5:45. The silence at meals was not a formal rule written anywhere. It was simply how the camp ate. Men with 11 or 12 hours of physical work ahead of them did not spend the time before it talking, and a camp that tried to enforce conversations over breakfast would have found itself short of appetite and short of daylight both. Dufresne's schedule ran against this rhythm rather than with it. He left before the cutting crews were even at table, which meant his own breakfast came from whatever the cook had set aside for the drivers the night before, eaten standing in the cookhouse doorway, or more often, not eaten at all until he reached the river landing hours later. This was one of the quieter costs of the job that no one at Belleau ever totaled up formally. The driver's day did not fit the camp's day, and a man who hauled 18 miles to the river and back rarely ate a hot meal at the same table or at the same hour as the rest of the crew. By the 1950s, the camp's crew was not exclusively French-Canadian, as it would likely have been a generation earlier. A small number of Atikamekw men worked seasonally at camps throughout the upper Saint-Maurice watershed by this decade. a pattern documented across the region's forest operations as paper companies and their subcontractors drew labor from wherever they could find it during the industry's peak years. Whether any specific man worked at a camp precisely like Bellows in precisely this winter is not something this script claims to know. What can be said is that the camp's 40 men, whoever exactly they were in any given season, lived and worked inside a structure, a subcontractor camp feeding a paper company's mill that was, in February of 1954, itself in the middle of a change none of them had any part in deciding. What was that change, and what did it have to do with the 11 cords riding behind Aurel Dufresne's truck that morning? The change that had nothing to do with Aurel Dufresne and everything to do with where his 11 cords were ultimately headed was a corporate one. Sometime in 1954, the same winter Dufresne drove his 9th season on the Belleau Road, the Brown Corporation, the American-owned company that had built and operated the region's largest mill at La Tuque since before the First World War, sold its Quebec assets to Canadian International Paper, a subsidiary of the U.S.-based International Paper Company. Brown had put up the mill's first dam and pulp works in 1907, produced what is documented as Canada's first recognized craft paper by 1928, and had run La Tuque for nearly half a century as one of the classic company towns of the era, its ownership woven into the daily life of the town in ways that ranged from electric streetlights to a company-run infirmary. None of this, the sale, the new ownership, the corporate history behind it, reached the Belleau camp in any form that changed what Aurel Dufresne did that February morning. The wood he hauled did not know whose ledger it would eventually appear on. What the sale illustrated, more than it changed anything about the immediate work, was the scale of the industry that a camp of 40 men and one hauling truck fed into. By this decade, the stretch of the Saint-Maurice between La Tuque and Rivière, not quite 200 kilometers of river Rivière, carried more newsprint mill capacity than almost any comparable stretch of river anywhere in the world. 7 separate newsprint mills had been built along it between 1887 and 1922 alone, drawing capital from Canada, the United States, and Europe. By 1957, a few years past the winter this script follows, Canadian newsprint production would account for roughly 3/4 of the entire world's newsprint exports. And a substantial share of that wood had, at some point in its journey, passed through a company landing, very much like the one at the end of the Belleau Road. That landing was not the wood's destination. It was where the truck's work ended and the rivers began. From the landing, the cordwood, cut to exactly 4 feet for this reason, a length the industry called pitoon, would wait through the rest of the winter for spring breakup, when river drivers called draveurs would push it into the current and ride it downstream, working logs apart where they jammed, guiding them with long pike poles through a system of river improvements the pulp companies had built and maintained for decades, specifically to move wood this way. The truck's 18 miles were a short haul feeding a much longer one, a river system that, in February of 1954, still carried the overwhelming majority of the valley's wood to mill, and would go on doing so for another 4 decades before the practice ended for good. What, in the years after this particular winter, made the short hauls start to matter more than the river drive it fed? And what did that change take away from a road and a driver who had never needed to think about the river at all? At us, none of what happened to the Belleau Road happened quickly, and none of it happened because of any single decision. Through the later 1950s and into the 1960s, provincial and company road building reached further into the Haute Mauricie than it had in Dufresne's early years. And at some point in that decade, no single year is documented for this specific stretch, only the general pace of the period's road improvement across the region. The worst of the 18 miles, including the approach to the second crossing, was widened, regraded, and given a proper culverted crossing in place of the timber and fill dip that had nearly cost Dufresne his load back in 1946. What the improved crossing removed was not the driver's job. It removed the specific knowledge that had made the driver's job what it was: the read of glaze on packed snow, the particular gray-white sheen under a headlamp, the private sense of which mild spells turned dry crossing ice dangerous. A wider road with real drainage and a proper culvert did not care what the previous afternoon's weather had been. It held its surface regardless, and a driver coming after Dufresne no longer needed the 1,800 passes it had taken Dufresne to learn what he knew. The same decades brought hydraulic loading to landings across the valley, replacing the two-man hand-built load with a mechanical loader that could stack a sled or a truck bed in a fraction of the time. Faster and, within its own tolerances, more consistent than what two loaders' hands and eyes had produced, but blind to the specific hand feel of green versus half-dried wood that bellows loaders had never needed to explain to anyone, because everyone who mattered already understood it. And as provincial highways reached further into the region, the road that eventually became Route 155, following the Saint-Maurice's east bank past Rivière aux Raies itself, trucks began hauling wood directly from camp to mill on public roads built and maintained to a standard no single subcontractor camp could ever have afforded, bypassing the river landing, the spring wait, and eventually the dravers altogether. None of this happened overnight, and camps did not vanish from the Rivière aux Raies country the moment a highway truck could reach a mill without the river's help. Logging camps are documented as having operated at the mouth of the Rivière aux Raies itself into the 1980s. 3 decades after the winter this script follows, long after Dufresne's own working years, long after the second crossing had been reduced to an unremarkable culvert crossing that told a new driver nothing about what it had once demanded of the men who drove it. The change came, in other words, exactly the way most changes in this industry came, not as a single event a driver could point to, but as a slow substitution of one kind of certainty, a driver's private embodied read of one crossing's ice for another kind, built into concrete and steel, requiring no one to carry it in his hands at all. If this channel is going to keep documenting what was in these trucks and in the men who drove them, subscribe. There are more roads, more crossings, more load decisions, and more private judgments that lived in a driver's hands for 9 winters, or 16, or 30, and were never once written down. The specific relationship between a loaded international pulling a timber sled over packed snow, 18 miles of company road, and a driver who knew the exact afternoon that snow would stop holding is not something any provincial highway or hydraulic loader has ever been built to need again. And if you have a memory of a truck, a road, a river drive, a camp, put it in the comments. If you or your family hauled pulpwood on a St. Maurice Valley Company road, rode a drive, or worked a camp de bûcheron anywhere in the Mauricie, what do you remember about the season the road or the river turned against you? A future video on this channel will follow the drivers of the Saint-Maurice itself, the men who rode the Pitoun down the river that this truck's whole winter of hauling was built to feed. Sometime in the 1960s, no precise year is documented for this specific stretch of road, the Belleau Road's second crossing was rebuilt. The timber and fill dip that had nearly taken Aurel Dufresne and 11 cords of green spruce into the gully back in 1946 was widened, regraded, and given a concrete culvert in place of packed snow and ice over corduroy. What the rebuilt crossing gave the operation: fewer things a new driver needed to be told before he could safely run the road, fewer mornings each winter when a load had to be taken at walking pace instead of the pace it was taken every other day, a crossing that no longer cared, in any way that mattered to the man behind the wheel, what the previous afternoon's sun had done to the ice, what it removed, the need to know what that specific bend, at that specific dip, did to 11 cords of green-black spruce on a morning after a mild spell. It removed the particular gray-white sheen a driver learned to read under his own headlamps, knowledge built from roughly 1,800 passes, and one afternoon in a driver's second winter that he never fully described to another man. Dufresne kept driving the Belleau Road for years after the crossing was rebuilt. He said the new crossing was easier. He did not say what he meant by that. What can be said with more certainty is only this. Logging camps continued operating in the Rivière aux Rats country for decades yet, into the 1980s. Long after this particular winter, long after the crossing stopped asking anything of the men who drove it. A road that no longer asked a driver anything was a road that no longer needed a driver who knew anything in particular. And the 1,800 passes it had taken one man to learn a single bend on a single company road, feeding a valley that for decades supplied a meaningful share of the world's newsprint, belonged, after that, to no one at all.